Okay, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear students, welcome to this event, which is a double and triple event in a certain sense. As you know, the German Policy Network, European ValEUs, which comprises 20 universities, exists at Viadrina. Within that network, there is a seminar group ongoing, and we have linked our event to the Viadrina Institute for European Studies, IFES, Estella Schindel, as the coordinator is here. Welcome, and thank you for co-organizing this meeting. We are very happy to host Randall Halle from Pittsburgh University at our venue again at Viadrina. Although he's sitting in Pittsburgh, I think it's in the morning here. The sun is going down at this moment. Yeah, within the network, we discuss European values, and in a way a specific aspect around these European values, namely the difference between the values as you could read, understand, or interpret them from the treaties or other official announcement, and the way we perceive these values as being implemented on the ground. So this is the main topic of our network. I invite you to visit our homepage. I will post it in just a minute, and you can take a look if you're not familiar with that. Within that network, we had two workshops, and on those workshops, Randall Halle from Pittsburgh University gave a very interesting speech on European values in the EU's developmental, energy, and climate policies. And I found that very exciting and thought it would be a very good opportunity to recast this speech and have a discussion on it within our seminar here at Viadrina. Randall is a colleague and friend from Pittsburgh University, a film scholar and Germanist, director of the Institute of European Studies there at Pittsburgh University. Yeah, and now I would not talk much longer, but have Randall give his speech of about 40 to 50 minutes. You're invited to ask questions within that. At a certain stage, the live stream will be cut off, which also means that the recording will be cut off. And if you are not so certain, especially in the student environment here or at other places, you can also ask your questions after that when they're not recorded anymore. But at the moment, I'm very happy to see all of you here. And Randall, please, you have the floor.
Right. Can you all hear me? Everything's fine. Good. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Estella. Thank you, Frederica, Nico, everybody for the invitation. I'm really excited. I always enjoy and profit myself from the relationship with the Viadrina, and the ValEUs Project itself is an outgrowth of that. So it's lovely to see you at a distance, electronically at least. I wish I were there in person. I'm going to talk to you today in general about what Tim just described. I'm going to try and pace it. I have, to begin with, to mention I'm a film scholar, Germanist, and I'd say Europeanist at this point in time. So I'm going to first play about 3.5 minutes of a short of a film designed to describe a successful European project in Eritrea, and then I'm going to switch over to discussing generally the development policy landscape. From that point, I will switch to a historic discussion of the development of what I'm describing as developmentalism, and then return to the present and think about the European Green Deal and the way that the contemporary European development policy is playing out. So with that, let me first play this short film, and I hope you'll understand why.
Eritrea has one of the lowest electrification rates in the world. Its lack of electrical power has a big impact on the daily life of thousands of people. The electric grid only covers a limited area coverage of the territory and reaches only a portion rural areas, which is less than 11%. The areas and villages not served by the electric grid have to rely on generators. And being dependent on generators means to be dependent on fuel, volatile prices, and long journeys from the fuel storage facilities to the remotest areas. In such conditions, it is extremely difficult to run a business or to provide essential services to the population. This was the situation in the villages of Araza and Maiduma before the installation of the solar power plants. The moment when the future arrived in the villages of Araza and Maiduma was January 2015, when the EU, together with the UNDP and the government of the state of Eritrea, started to implement, design, and install a solar-powered mini-grid plant. The aim of the project was to provide modern, clean, and affordable energy to the two rural towns and the surrounding villages. The total cost of the project was 11.7 million euros, and the EU contributed with the most substantial part, 8 million euros. It was completed in March 2019 and now provides power to 513 small and medium enterprises, 12 schools, 2 kindergartens, 2 community hospitals, 5 health stations, and public organizations. Beyond these numbers, what is important is that the EU-financed solar power plant represents a groundbreaking improvement in the life of over 50,000 people. Masarat is a nurse midwife. She works at the health center in Araza village. She helps women of the area to deliver their babies.
እጅግን ከምዚ ባህል ነገር የለን ኖርማል ቀጥሪ ማለት እዩ ቀጥሪ ንውላሉ ከት ንሓደርንስ ሓደ ማለት እዩ ኣብ ስራሕ ይፀገም ነይሩ እጅግ ተዛዛ ማለት ይጽፋል ማለት ልጅ ናምከናሉ ማለት እዩ ለዴሊቨሪ ሴታት ይላል ድሬሲንግ ብራሉ መሳርሒ ይመክላሉ ኦክሲጅን ጋር ሰብ ተመጽና ኦክሲጅን ተቀመሉ ካለ ደግሞ ከዘይት ደግሞ ፔሸንት ተምድለተ ማለት እዩ
The benefits that whole communities can harness from the project is clear in terms of social, economic, and environmental indicators, from households to workshops, from schools to businesses, from offices to public spaces. For many, electric power, easily and regularly available, is the means and the guarantee to be able to earn a living and build their future in their native village for themselves and their families, so that they do not feel forced to move to towns or to...
Okay, that cut off abruptly, I'm sorry. But it finishes up this last segment. It simply finishes up by saying, with the funding that we're providing, these people then have a better life, that they don't have to migrate, in effect, to Europe. And with that, I wanted to actually just spend 2 seconds talking about this particular video to underscore, one, that it's a progress narrative. It sets up a situation in which we see a space in the world that is distant and backwards, and that is in need of help, and that help is being provided out of a sense of European generosity. As I have here in the slide, you see that in the narrative itself, it touches a number of explicit European, what we might describe as European Commission-based values, including the interview with the clinic director who is talking about birth and in effect, the situation of women. But subtly behind that is this idea of a kind of anti-immigration, anti-migration motivation to the story. If we develop there, then they don't come here. But what's interesting for me is that the dynamic that we're also seeing in its presentation as something positive, and that seems to be benefiting the local, it faces quite a bit the fact that this is a technology-based initiative, and as it emerged in 2015, it was primarily funding that went to a UK-based, at that time, the United Kingdom, Britain was still in the EU, went to a UK-based solar farm that was having problems actually competing against the Chinese flooding of the market with cheap solar technology. And because direct support of the company would have violated free trade, development support actually poured money into the purchasing of the equipment that we see in the solar park in Eritrea. It's also a development project, a UN development project, and that means it works with the United States. And the second largest beneficiary for this project was actually Tesla, because Tesla provided the batteries. So already from this very brief thing, this is a kind of short film that advertises the success of projects everywhere throughout the development world. This is something that shows us that there's a kind of primary beneficiary is within the European economy, and not necessarily for the present. That is to say, the local and the regional interests that are being developed. What I have not been able to find out is the subsequent history of this site. There is no more information about it. And what I fear is very typical for a lot of development projects is that there wasn't any funding for continuing the technological upgrade. And the fact that the UK left the EU, that the company that provided the technology is outside, likely means that this is now possibly not functioning at all, because there is need for a kind of frequent upkeep for solar projects in particular. And there's a number of projects like this that I can speak directly about, things that are much more known, Desert Tech, et cetera, et cetera. But maybe we can save that and move on to kind of the meat and potatoes here of the presentation. I'd like to start out with actually just a couple questions to prompt your own thinking, and some maps here for us to also prompt that thinking, and to ask you, how do we envision the EU or Europe's relationship to the Southern Mediterranean? And we see here three different models of thinking about the relationship to the Southern Mediterranean, one from the period of colonialism, one from the immediate post-war neocolonial development that I'll be talking about more extensively, and a map of a much more recent 2020 envisioning of a relationship with Africa. One of the things that's interesting for us to think about in the final map is that, unlike the other maps, Europe isn't present, even though it's orchestrator of all those relationships. It's not present in the frame of the map. But also that map looks very similar in its structure and shading to the colonial, immediate decolonial map of Africa. So looking at the history of development, one of the things that I would ask you as a second question is, what is the difference between financing for development and humanitarian aid? And this is something that's frequently confused. And in fact, a language of helping and needing, helping needy people, supporting hunger, etc. That's something that inflects development financing, but is often to be distinguished off as something separate in humanitarian aid. And I'll come back to this later, I think. This notion of Africa as needy that we just saw in the short film, one of my questions to you would be, what is it that's necessary for Africa to appear this way in our development relationship? That it's a space of need? And furthermore, given that the Mercosur negotiations between Latin America or the negotiations around free trade with China are in a similar framework, but yet not presented as development, what does that say about the European relationship to Africa? And if we're talking about infrastructure upgrades that are necessary both in Africa and in Europe, what is the difference in the approach that we have to those two kinds of projects? So those are some questions to just have floating around in your head as you understand, or as I go through this kind of EU development landscape for us to be thinking about. As is typical of the EU, there are a number of different institutions associated with the Commission. The Directorate Generals are in particularly important for us perhaps to understand that there is the Directorate General INTPA is something that emerged in 2011. It is a unit that is motivated in its policy statements by the pursuit of European values, sustainable development, democracy, human rights, the rule of law across the world. This is text from the DG itself. This is a DG that emerged when it was created out of the Directorate General for Development and Relationships with Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific States, DEV. And this relationship goes all the way back to the colonial relationship. And I'll give you some of that history in a moment. But there is this long kind of trajectory thinking about values as they change. Here in particular, the focus on climate comes to the fore. The language here is a language that is one of partnership versus aid. And this is something that represents a kind of critical assessment of the nature of development work itself. And in this, we also see an emphasis on sub-Saharan Africa as central to the European developmental regime. Another DG that's associated, that does much more than development work, but is in effect responsible for the funding that goes out, because INTPA doesn't actually have funds. The funds come from other places for its initiatives. So you see here the DG Economy and Finance also has some subsections in discussing development. Here it uses the phrase development aid. And I would underscore that that comes closer to that confusion of humanitarian aid and development financing. Because in its first point, the EU is the largest donor of development aid. It uses a language of donor and recipient that obfuscates the fact that this is not a donor relationship, but a financial transactionary relationship. We see here that development, nevertheless, is something that's working in the larger parameters of the EU within its notions of climate mitigation, which is something I'll return to in a moment. But these two Directorate Generals have to work within various initiatives and parameters that have been set forward in general through the European Commission. And a primary way that the direction of development policy is created, is initiated, is through this initiative, the Global Gateway, which is the primary EU development policy initiative that was started in 2021, a direct outcome of the first von der Leyen Commission. And if we go back for a second and recognize that the Economy and Finance DG says that there is $2 billion a year available, one of the things that becomes interesting for us to consider is that the Global Gateway promises to go well beyond, mobilizing up to $300 billion euros of investments. And again, in quotes, those are things taken out of the direct language of the Global Gateway itself. And you can see here how the language of values, various kinds of European values are explicitly identified as important for this project. A values-driven, high standard and transparent infrastructure partnership to meet global infrastructure development needs. The Global Gateway is in effect a response on the part of the EU to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and especially its interventions in Africa. And what's interesting for us to understand there is, as up to this point, Africa has been really the European sphere of influence. And what we find is that there's an anxiety about the way that the Chinese are moving in. Europe remains the primary trade partner with African partners, but the percentage that China has within the trade relations in Africa is rapidly growing and displacing primarily European interests. So this global gateway is explicitly understood and has devoted 150 billion euros for Africa. You can see listed there in bold some of the policy initiatives based on 6 principles. Again, the first 3 one might describe as based in European values. But what's interesting for us to consider is that the second 3, green and clean, security focused, and catalyzing private sector investment, wind up actually being the fundamental fundamentally structuring the nature of the projects that are put forward, right? And the global gateway was something that then was inflected with the European Green Deal, as that became a central target for all of the European Commission's, all of the EU's initiatives during the first von der Leyen Commission presidency. One last slide, and then I'll just see if there's any questions that we can talk about and clarify for a second here. But if there's a promise within the Commission in the DG Economy and Finance, here of 2 billion, here we can start recognizing what's happening with and how it's possible to have 300 billion euros coming together. Because a new initiative in a post-pandemic world that emerged within the EU was this Team Europe initiatives structure. Noted here, it starts in 2023. And the idea of it was that it was post-pandemic pooling of resources in which EU member states, including their implementing agencies and public development banks, so the various ministries of development in the various governments, various kinds of development banks, would work together with the European Investment Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development to bring together more resources than would have otherwise been possible through the pool alone of funds that flow through the European Union itself, through the European Union and Commission. So the DG Economy and Finance only has 2 billion, and you can see this kind of coordination structure allows for a much more expanded, but an expanse that is based in banking and financing and private sector interests, rather than any kind of notion of humanitarian aid, if you will. So just to summarize this a little bit, some of the things that we're seeing, because it might be what I just presented is one of those European Union bewildering experiences of various kinds of acronyms and various kinds of structures. But what we see here is a move of coordination in which the EU is functioning as a transnational treaty and consensus-based entity that's coordinating these kinds of resources that I just listed, like the various banks, ministries at the local and regional level, as well as European banks. Right. And if it's confusing, and I've shown you a series of moves in shifting policy structures, and partly it is confusing because each of these new initiatives is often presented through social media as brand new and on its own. It's important to recognize that part of what the EU is trying to do in a world of polycrisis, in a world of rapidly transforming global structures, to embed a certain kind of, to create a certain kind of new responsiveness. So idea here is to create programming, not necessarily long-term development initiatives, but programming that can be rethought on a quick basis and respond to new things. So, for instance, the hunger crisis that initiated out of the destruction of the wheat, or the energy crisis that came about as a result of both out of the result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That was something that wasn't on the horizon immediately, and so a need for responsiveness has come up. So a third thing here that I would underscore that is important for us to see is that there are Eurocentric economics at work, that in spite of the language of partnership and the idea of developing schools and hospitals and serving need and interests that are local, the actual funding, the work that's taking place is based in private sector interests that are in Europe, right? And largely private sector interests evolve into a few areas. So we're not talking about state-to-state support for the historic buildings of grand dams, or mega bridges or these kinds of things per se. But private sector interests largely devolve into interests in resources extraction, global outsourcing, i.e. cheap overseas labor structures, foreign direct investment into emerging businesses or mining structures, for instance. And finally, perhaps private sector interests are interested in dumping their overstock or their own technological waste on markets that are saturated in, say, Europe, the United States, or even in China. And out of this, the final point that I would want to make, and pointing forward, it's not necessarily exactly clear here from what I presented, but there is a kind of developmental deafness. So in spite of the language of partnership, one of the things that when we look at each of the DGs and the resources that they put together and put out, we recognize that there are no actual eye-level partners at work. No African partner, for instance, is immediately in the governing or the decision-making positions within the EU about how funding is going to take place and where it's going to go. So this means that, in effect, we need a kind of vision of the recipient. So ultimately, this donor-recipient model remains in place. The economy and finance DG is more accurate, perhaps, in describing what's happening. But we need a kind of donor-recipient in which moral generosity is put forward to give out money to help those poor, needy people. And there is no way for us to understand the local as having, say, a knowledge of its own that might be valued. The images that we see, for instance, that we just saw from Eritrea, are not of urban centers, but rather rural areas. And we can certainly find in various parts of Europe cities and towns that would look just like them, but they're set in a different time frame. There is no vision of lively cultural production that's not dependent or developing out of EU sources. There are very few independent scientists or local problem-solving engineers. And even when they show up like the head of the clinic who has to give birth or who has to assist women in giving birth with flashlights, and her technological future is based in the EU and not in her own knowledge. So that's quite a bit at this moment. And I do wonder if there's any questions or any responses to some of the things that I've been putting forward before I switch over to give a kind of brief history of European developmentalism.
Yes, thank you, Randall. So in this section, it's visible for everyone. Does anybody have any questions? Hold on. Maybe if you use your digital hand so I can see it. I have a question, Randall. When talking about values, the network is called ValEUs. Now, there is a difference between helping and developing on the one hand, and investment and finance on the other, and both are somehow intertwined. Do you attach values to each of these dimensions already, or not? Is that not what you're aiming at? Like, is helping good, or might development be problematic, or this is the question I have.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Tim. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that when we talk about values, what I think we see frequently is that there is a pro forma citation of the fundamental documents of the origins of the European project, the European Declaration on Human Rights, for instance, and then various kinds of values like gender, sexuality, support for women, indeed, human rights, democracy. These are things that show up variously, but are not necessarily coordinated consistently throughout any of the projects. So the projects themselves seem to me to be evidencing a kind of citation as decoration of the foundational, quote unquote, values of the European project. But I do think fundamentally, yes, that economics has a set of values to it. And as I was just suggesting, that the idea there is a critical development literature that suggests a need to be at eye level and engage in partnerships that are different than aid relationships. So in the German Ministerium, for instance, it's the Ministerium für wirtschaftliche Zusammenarbeit, the Ministry for Cooperation, right? Economic cooperation. And that suggests a kind of primary eye-level relationship. But yet, as I just pointed out, in none of these quote-unquote eye-level relationships is it a discussion that's taking place with the partner on the other side defining what the structure is needed. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how all of this actually winds up remaining within an Eurocentric economic system. And I guess I would turn it back to everybody and say, okay, if the EU is the bank in all situations, doesn't the bank get the right to determine the conditions of the loan that's being put out? And isn't that just the way economics work? And that would be a kind of fundamental value here. That's a long answer, but I think that those set up certain kinds of problems for us in thinking about what economic values might mean in terms of a developmental relationship. Anya, you have a question.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Good?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, well, it's my first taking part at this value network. So let's say I'm new, and I wonder, thank you very much, first of all, for also your very critical, helpful thoughts on these policies. And I wonder how you would place interest in this whole kind of deal, because I actually do not wonder at all about what you have presented. I mean, it's if you look from the angle of values, you may be more critical than if you look from the angle of interest. And you already pointed to the growing Chinese presence in Africa. I mean, we are talking about a competition, and so the European Union has to place itself. So I wonder whether you found any notion of interest, of realistic, in terms of international theory, realistic interests, and how do you juxtapose it to values? So do they compete, values and interests, or are values also in order to sell interests?
Yeah, no, you're already framing some of the things that I would say. I think, Anya, it's interesting to step back for a second and recognize that development policy is driven by the current European economic understanding, or the economic understanding that is current in Europe, that is to say, in the West at any given time. By which I mean that in the 50s, 60s, as development policy starts to emerge, it's interest in heavy industry and state-to-state relationships. By the 80s, with the move of the neocons into a neoliberal economics, we start seeing private sector interests moving to the fore. It's not that private sector wasn't there before, but now it's there. And you can immediately start thinking about big state projects now into private structures, right? And that the interest is the interest that's motivating European development policy is related again to the interest of the private sector, and not the private sector as a global private sector per se, but the European private sector. So that's one way to think about it. And often the projects then are developed without thinking about local interests. So the desert tech or other kinds of energy infrastructure projects that are being planned or initiated are sometimes undertaken without any consideration of the local grid. And if the energy from solar panels that would be produced were actually inserted into a local grid, it might blow out the local grid, is often the case through wind or solar that's happening. And I'll look at Namibia later on. But the idea there is that Namibia initially is to be seen just as a sunny spot to produce green hydrogen that would be delivered to Germany for the within the liquid natural gas terminals that are being built at this point in time. So the interests here are always then European interests and motivated by European economic calculations. Estella?
Yes, thank you, Randall, for this first part of the talk, and you show how important it is to disentangle this very intricate network of institutions, acronyms, and structures that are being completely renewed from time to time, and it's sometimes difficult to understand what's really behind them. I was wondering, following on the previous questions in terms of values, what about the developmental model itself? Is there any way, any gap, any crack in this discourse, in these policies to maybe question, is this the only the only path of development that's possible? What margin there would be for other knowledges, other strategies, even the degrowth approaches, for instance, that are being discussed in Europe itself, and even the framework of sustainability that is being criticized on one side seems to not find a place here, right? I mean, at least in the material we're quoting here, I haven't seen any reference to that. I don't know if you want to say something now, or maybe it's included in the next parts of the talk.
No, and I'll say something briefly and then perhaps move on to a little bit of the history. And I think, Estella, one of the things that's frustrating at the moment is I did a lot of research around the Green Deal, and we're going to talk about the Green Deal today, but already the EU has shifted in the already a year or two ago, the move away from the Green Deal after the last round of elections and the kind of collapse of the Green Wave. And now the agenda is the Clean Deal, which we're hearing about. And so what I find interesting, again, is nevertheless there is an ease of transition from the Green Deal to the Clean Deal, because ultimately, always already behind the European Green Deal was this neoliberal private sector interest that was structuring the decisions, structuring the policy support that was being put forward. So it's not that there's a sudden break, but there is a consistency in trends forward. And I think there's two things that are of interest for us to consider. One is that when we do research on the EU, we need to be not only caught up in trying to figure out what the acronyms are, but trying to figure out what the trajectory is. right? And if we're interested in writing policy, I actually think that the attention to the trajectory is more helpful than the immediate institutions themselves, because those institutions keep changing in each new commission, and now likely within the commission's 4 years, they will be changing and shifting as well. And so that's important. And yes, there's a whole set of development literature that I'm happy to share some sources that promotes modernization and nation building and is still very prevalent. There is a critical development literature that sought to say maybe things have not been working out because there's corruption and there's misappropriation of funds. But the critical development literature is always nevertheless embedded in a development agenda, right? And so there is, outside of that, one might say from post-colonial or decolonial directions, a fundamental rejection of development as such. And I'll give you, and there you actually need to work with then say, especially sources from Africa, but Latin America is rich with people responding back around Mercosur in Latin America. The African Union has been pushing forward with criticism of the EU and its policies. And one of the things that's interesting for us to consider is that development in Africa is best supported by inter-African trade. Right? And I'm going to address this in a moment, but inter-African trade is the best way to develop Africa. Right? But all of the private sector economic interests, and all the way back to the state-based interests of the decolonizing period, have been about keeping African economic activity tied first to Europe and not cross-border inter-African trade. So if you look at any kind of infrastructure that's being built for transportation, at this point in time through the Global Gateway, it's always about, say, train tracks that bring cobalt out of Zambia out to a port to enter into the global trade route. Right? And there's one last thing that I guess I would say at this moment that's interesting in thinking about development vis-a-vis energy policy, is that the great morality and generosity of the EU is based here in getting cobalt from a place like Zambia, the Congo, in order to create a resolution in Europe that keeps the economy functioning at the level that it's at, making Europe a green space while actually creating mining disasters in the region in which the extractive activity is taking place. Right? And so it's not benefiting, and the responsibility for climate mitigation is actually placed on the African rather than on the European sources of climate pollution, CO2. Right? So Africans are made responsible for providing the resources so that Europe and the United States, for that matter, can actually respond and keep their energy production going at the level that the Europeans want without considering the African environment. No. All right, maybe I should move on.
Yes, go do that, please. So I want to go through a couple slides fairly quickly, just to remind us that decolonization and the European project went hand in hand. We often think about the European project as emerging out of the devastation at the end of World War II and the need to rebuild Europe. But it's also the case that it's not just a matter of rebuilding Europe, but rebuilding European colonial relationships with the rest of the world. And the end of the war, simultaneously with the end of the war, the move in the colonized world towards decolonization really takes off. And I have a few dates here, but May 8th, 1945, one of the first massacres in Algeria takes place,
that sparks then what will become the Algerian Civil War. The Indochina War breaks out in September of 1945, and so the French colonial relationship is imperiled already as things are ending. Same thing with the UK relationship to India, to the Mandate Palestine, Indonesian independence from the Netherlands takes place in 1949. And all of this we can see intertwined with various aspects of the move forward into the European project, the European coal and steel community and the European economic community. Famously out of this, and something that Pio Hansen and Stefan Jonsson have discussed in their project on Euro-Africa, is how the initial Treaty of Rome that defined the European Economic Community in 1957 actually is based on thinking about this relationship to Africa. And so if you haven't looked at that founding treaty, it's well worth taking a peek at. But you would see that Articles 131 through 136 are precisely about defining the relationship to Africa, to the colonies, to the decolonizing situation, to the point where within the negotiations, again, going back to this map that I showed you earlier, there are a whole set of countries or territories that are not yet independent countries that are immediately folded into without having had any representation, any ability to discuss, any ability to respond to the development of the European Economic Community. They're immediately folded into this structure as overseas territories and economic interests. And I want to remind us that this process moves very quickly in Africa in particular. In 1945, there are 4 independent countries on the continent of Africa. By 1975, there are 43 independent countries. At this point in time, 2024, there are 50, I guess we're in 2025 now, there are 54 independent countries. So the majority of decolonization takes place in this period. And this is what drives a lot of the thinking and the concerns, because the economic structures of the colonial states needs to be reorganized. So a number of things that we see happening here is in this slide that I would like to underscore. And 1955, as part of the move towards decolonization, for instance, we see the formation of a new set of successor banks to the institutions that the French in particular, but also the British, had set up to fund the colonial project. These become the central banks for the countries as they move towards independence. To this day, these central banks are still in operation. The Institut d'émission de l'Afrique occidentale and the Institut d'émission, they have a trajectory that changes, but nevertheless, these are central banks that were up until 1975 headquartered in Paris, right, and controlled the economic interests of those states and pegged their currencies to the French franc. Another thing that's important in this process is then with the Treaty of Rome, those countries that I showed you that were forced to be signatories were also forced into the associated African states and Madagascar, AASM countries, that created a unit for which the EU could negotiate. And this is the same group of countries that moved all the way up into the DG for development, as I noted before. It is associated states, Madagascar, and the Caribbean that had been the center of control within, or the center of negotiation within the DG until it became the DG Interpa. So the kind of key points that I would want to take out of this is that the process of colonial devolution is done in an orderly fashion from the perspective of the European interests, the interest of the European economic community, to embed people to embed the developing, the newly emerging countries in the economic structures and the economic interests of the European project. Right? What this means, however, is that African territories and countries are not allowed to form a bloc, even if they're forced into an association. They're not allowed to form a bloc. They're required to negotiate with a European bloc, 6, then eventually 28, 27, 20 countries that negotiate as a bloc with individual country partners in Europe, which is always an uneven and unequal relationship of negotiation. And there's much more that I could say about that history. But one of the things I mentioned earlier about coordination is that coordination is not a new thing. And the development relationship that is coordinated here is a relationship that emerges precisely out of the structures of European rebuilding in the post-war era. So with the Marshall Funds, you have structures that are put in place in 48. And as the various economic miracles start taking place in Germany, in Italy, France, etc., you have a shift away from using this money to develop structures in Europe to thinking about using the money to foster quote unquote development in the overseas territories. So we see here that the OEEC, which was for the Marshall Funds, becomes the OECD, which is now for the development relationship overseas. Likewise, we see the emergence of ministries for development in 1961 in Germany as part of the process of the formation of the economic community. Germany has its own Ministerium für Zusammenarbeit. And this is a ministerium that actually its precursor form had been the Ministry for the Distribution of Marshall Funds in the German state itself. And so this emerges at that point in time. And all of these things are coordinated and involved in interstructural relations. I just want to take a second to actually look at the documentation of this period and say that Walter Scheel, who eventually goes on to be Bundespräsident, is the head of the first Ministry of Development, and in 1966 puts forward this very interesting text, which itself can be downloaded from the ministry in its own history, and is well worth reading and is very interesting for us to start thinking about what the documentation is and what kind of founding fathers, as it were, that we can find in their own thinking here. And what Scheel says at that time is that the motivation for development aid is out of a moral responsibility to fight poverty and hunger. So already there we see something of values. But he then goes on to say that it's also about better political relationship to the new peoples, by which he means that given a colonial history, development actually helps obviate any need for reparations by providing a relationship in which we, in the West, support various interests in Africa that align themselves with us. Therefore, there's no need for reparations because we're still sending money, but actually that money is always something that is within European interests. I've already talked about Eurocentric economics, but here what is surprising is that in his own discussion of why one should engage in development, he says that it will strengthen our economy. right? And it will enrich our European culture. He's not talking explicitly about strengthening the African economy. He's talking about strengthening the European economy. He describes that this is going to have to take place through European experts, through progress stories, and through technology. And that always places the Europeans at the position of being the ones who control the technology. So it would be possible to train engineers. It would be, and that's been part of development all along, training. But yet those engineers that are what one might describe as local or indigenous are never given the leadership roles within these relationships. And finally, in the text, Shale goes on to describe that this is going to be something that will cause pain to the countries to be developed. And this is very much reminiscent of shock therapy language that was applied to the post-socialist states in the European East. But the idea is we know better, we need to modernize, it's going to hurt them, but in the long run, it's for their benefit because they will have industry that will be intersecting with ours, and that will be good for us. And it's a win-win because all that pain that they'll experience will eventually get them to the place where we are now. Let me see. I have maybe one more slide and I can... or let me just see if there's any questions before I move on to focus on the more contemporary moment here where I'm going. Tim said I have 2 minutes to talk about all these other things.
No, we're fine because there were questions in between, so we don't want to cut it short. It's very interesting. Are there any questions? Dagmara, why don't you turn on your camera once you talk?
Hey, Dagmara.
Hi. I have a question or comment, maybe. Thank you for your talk until this moment. And my questions is, how is the questions or the fact that like 1/3 of the today member of European Union used to be in Comecon. And of course, Comecon also used to work with own values with Africa, and there was the competition of the system in the Cold War. So did you find about this values and how is in your research focus the fact of the almost 40 years the pass in the Comecon? Thank you.
No, that's great. And in fact, actually, what's interesting is that one might say that the East Bloc and the West Bloc, as it were, pursued during that period within the Cold War sphere of influence policies that were nevertheless similar, which is to say big infrastructure building projects like the Aswan Dam are one of the things that is perhaps best known. But what was interesting about that, I think, in what I'm looking at, and part of what I've also been pursuing that that Estella, for instance, and other people know a little bit of what I've been interested in, is actually the way that non-alignment emerged to be a response within the developing world that sought to reject both the East Bloc and the West Bloc and create a route of development that was Southern hemisphere-based interests. And I think on that level, Dagmara, one of the key players there was Yugoslavia and Tito in defining the non-aligned movement. And so the Comecon was indeed, going back to Anya and Estella's questions, an alternative set of interests that were not necessarily oriented towards the same kind of economic dependency, had a very different language of why there was intervention, why there was support, in effect, to support decolonization. But leading figures within the decolonial movements themselves were much more interested in supporting non-alignment rather than the requirement of alignment. And I think part of what we see then is non-alignment in development relationships winds up being overwhelmed by the corrupting influence both of East Bloc and West Bloc structures vis-a-vis African and other global leaders at the time. So you buy people in powers of authority who will follow through on your interests rather than actually negotiating around local interests. And I think that that's, if you speak, or the African scholars that I've been speaking with and who have been doing research, that would be their take on that moment in the past. And the last thing about this, I think I would add that's perhaps important is that with the breaking away of the Soviet Union, of the East Bloc, the Warsaw Pact, one of the things that we wind up seeing is indeed this move to the neoliberal private sector of the 90s moving forward within development interests. All of that isn't to say that there weren't rich relationships of exchange and trade. GDR and Angola, famously, these are things that need to be honored, but are not in any way to be understood as heroic on either side of the blocks, as it were.
Yeah, thank you, Dagmar. Randall, if decolonial scholars reject the developmental approach, is there something in it which goes to its place? Are we talking about compensation or reparation, or is there an idea of leaving the region alone would be best? What is? Can you say something about this?
Sure. And it's something that I can come to in a little bit as well. But for instance, I was just alluding to the fact that the African Union is critical of the EU. The African Union is trying to foster free trade zones within Africa that would parallel something of the structure of the free trade zone of the Schengen space, right? And so opening up the borders, transportation across those borders. What's interesting, however, is that the EU itself has intervened in the drawing together of those zones and has said, no, the EU, and if we go back to that map of the agenda for Africa from 2020 to 2022 that I showed at the beginning, the EU is saying, no, you're not going to, if you draw zones in the fashion that you're interested in drawing them, you won't receive any money from us. You won't be part of our development agenda. And that becomes a kind of reassertion of the primacy of the economic relationship to Europe, whereas the free trade zones that the Africans are trying to draw are interested in creating support for places where there's already trade across borders in Africa. So this inter-African trade, the AU is interested in supporting, whereas the EU is interested in making sure that that is diminished and it only goes to the north. Right? And so Tim, there are two ways of thinking about it. One is in a kind of degrowth agenda, Europe needs to resolve its own problems with climate change and its own economy, not at the expense here. That it is a false relationship. There is a second direction that you've rightly identified of reparations. And not just, we're not going to provide you with resources, but you actually have to pay for the long history of colonial extraction. And then the third is actually a kind of commitment to notions of growth and development that say, sorry, the Europeans have had their day in the sun. We need to develop. We need to develop according to our own interests, and we need to do that in such a way that may require us to use fossil fuels. But we're so far behind the Europeans should resolve their issues and allow us here to expand economically. So a kind of model that really emerges in new ways out of the old non-aligned movement thinking, which was really about creating structures that would support local economies. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Randall. And now you still already have the slide on, yeah? Africa and the European Green Deal.
So let me just quickly show you a couple things, and it's going to perhaps repeat some of the stuff that I've already shown you. But in 2020, and this is part of this unfolding history that moves us up into our own present. This is something I'm sure that Estella knows by heart. But the idea then of the European Green Deal and its goals is again embedded in a kind of sympathy and an understanding of values vis-a-vis the rest of the world, not just for Europe itself. And the European Green Deal, this slide is a little bit perplexing, but it shows us that every Directorate General was charged with aligning as much as possible their activity vis-a-vis the European Green Deal. So agriculture, transport, industry, all of them were required to align. And that meant, of course, then that development aligned with the European Green Deal. So you can see that in 2020, with the first von der Leyen administration, that the emphasis comes into an understanding of Africa as playing a very important role in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN set and to which the Europeans have committed themselves. And the strategy, a comprehensive this document towards a comprehensive strategy with Africa that was produced in 2020 uses its languages of partnerships and shared interests. It binds EU development aid to Africa with climate mitigation. But as I was just saying, it doesn't understand climate mitigation as primarily something that needs to be undertaken within industrialized societies at their expense, but rather in a relationship in which climate mitigation takes place through things like digitization in Africa and ultimately perpetuates a kind of extractive relationship in which Africa provides resources. But fundamentally, the comprehensive strategy with Africa positions the EU as the home of the specialists in the same way that shale and through the history of development thinking, that it is the EU, it is the global north that has the expertise, has the engineers, has the technology that the global south needs in order to accomplish the goals that the global north has set for the global south. So how does this work? And I just, again, I want to, because I have a German audience, I want to take this is the end of my slides. And there's much more there's many other cases that I could be talking about. But the relationship with Namibia has been in the German press quite a bit. And what's interesting for us to see is how within this project of the European Green Deal and the Global Gateway, relationships opened up with Africa that I could discuss, with Namibia that I could discuss in a great amount of detail if you want. But just tracing the way the negotiations work, we can see that in November 2022, as part of COP27, Ursula von der Leyen was present at COP27 and working to create economic relationships on the basis of the COP with various places, including Namibia, and signs an agreement, a partnership agreement with Namibia. But this has to be, this is a very open sort of memorandum of understanding. And a year later, within the newly emerged Global Gateway structures, the next set of meetings take place. And that is again at the highest level between Namibia and Ursula von der Leyen, with representatives from various member states in the conversation, and a promise of $1 billion, excuse me, 1 billion euros in investments. But this has to be coordinated. And what do you do with the 1 billion in investments? It has to be coordinated. And so you see, for instance, here, the Namibian Minister of Energy and Mines meeting with the State Secretary in the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. So this is green negotiations with German green interests and a Namibian Minister of Energy and Mines. And they come up with a number of projects that are going to take place. And shortly after that, what winds up happening is that the Afrikanische Handelskammer and the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit for Southern Africa, not South Africa, but for this region of Southern Africa, hold an information session for their members, of which there are over 200 members in the AHK in Southern Africa. And this information session actually, in effect, says, look, there's going to be a number of tenders coming out for projects. So be prepared for these project tenders to be coming out, because you have then the ability to bid for them and to do that successfully. And this is where a certain kind of local presence, a dependence, or some kind of foreign direct investment allows for a structure that European interests can bid for the development funds directly, and then carry out the projects that are looking to be local projects. And this is a final, this is potentially the final slide that I would share with you around the Green Deal and around this structure of funding, to show that within the Handelskammer initiative, the presentations that they show, in effect, a map of, and this is German interests alone in Namibia. And you can see that, in effect, there is vast portions of the Namibian countryside that is, in effect, being developed solely through and by and on the basis of European energy interests. Right? And what we have then is there is a secondary flowing out of wealth here to the local who are supplying workforce or services, but it is not primarily of interest for local industries. These companies are all, in effect, German companies with dependencies for the extraction of energy resources. And the creation of hydrogen, green hydrogen, is not immediately thought of as benefiting the Namibian energy need or energy infrastructure, but creates then a kind of comprador relationship here, where there are vast regions that are more directly economically dependent on Europe than they are on their local situation. So just some brief conclusions about the European Green Deal here. Africa was in no way positioned to become a leader in, if you want, a green capitalist economy, let alone any kind of degrowth economy, but rather it was positioned to supply necessary natural or energy resources to allow European capitalism to take on a green form. The European Green Deal did not contain funding for development projects initiated as African interests, but rather funding for projects that would respond to energy transition needs in Europe. The mining projects that are taking place, especially in the Sahel, and the creation of infrastructure to remove cobalt or lithium or other kinds of necessary minerals, have disrupted trade routes that nomadic peoples have been traveling for centuries, have, as mining projects, used up water in very arid climates, and have displaced people all in the same language of this is for your own good. This is the shock therapy that you need to go through. Your nomadic life is something that is primitive and backwards, and we're bringing you into modernity. So this language kind of continues through, and ultimately it leads me to really be thinking here about developmentalism, kind of in line with Foucault's discussions of governmentality, to be thinking about a way of thinking and presenting that is key to the policy that is put forward, that requires an actual really kind of deep rethinking of what its impact is, especially as we face rapid climate degradation. So with that, I'm going to stop. That was a lot. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you very much, Randall. This was very rich and very interesting. Do we have immediate questions? Anja Hennig, please.
If I may, I would also leave the students the first place.
But you ask the question and then we conclude the public session. So to say.
Okay, thanks, Randall, for this very fascinating, also very sad insight. I learned at school that there has taken place a paradigm shift. I mean, it's a long time ago in the 90s, from this development idea to help to self-help. A focus on sustainable development, local communities, all these microcredits. And I wonder, has there been taking place another paradigm shift backwards to a neo-colonial approach that is fostered by the Green Deal? Because here we have a clear asymmetric, relationship of who is in need. Or is this something that is going parallel? I mean, are there still these local kind of self-help initiatives, and the EU as entity is rather focusing on these very interest-based focused approach?
There was a lot of discussion of microcredits, for instance. And one of the things that's unfortunately happened, the microcredits were seen as often also a vector to support women and women within local production projects or agrarian projects. But unfortunately, the microcredits have wound up creating structures of debt and encumberment that have been actually exactly the opposite of what was promised. And there's been a further privatization of the companies, as it were, private sector companies offering banking structures, offering microcredits. And indeed in the United States, not as much in Europe, but it's a very similar structure in which here in the United States, undocumented laborers use companies to cash paychecks that then send remittances places. All of these things, nevertheless, take a chunk out of the money that they're earning. The promises within the microcredit structure in Africa or for that matter in India and other places where they were touted, has wound up actually being devastating for the most part, and leading to even more impoverishment. The thing that's interesting within the literature itself, both the scientific, as it were, the academic literature, and also the cultural literature, is the way the relationship to China is being represented. And China, in many ways, is here within the development relationship, the Donald Trump and Elon Musk of the whole structure. The Belt and Road Initiative offers an exploitative, extractive relationship that basically is completely open and honest about it, and says, you know, this is what we need, and you will pay. You'll give us the mining rights here, and then we'll give you this much money back. So it's a completely transactional relationship, and this relationship has led, for instance, to the Chinese building the largest museum to African art in Dakar. And these kinds of interesting trade-offs are decisions that were reached locally within a relationship with China. And the third, perhaps, model for us thinking about, so we have the quasi Western model of development that the United States and the European Union still pursue. We have China as a disruptor, and then we have Russia, right? And Russia using militia, private, its own private armies to go in and to, by force, take over regions, has been part of the destabilization of the Sahel, as is very well known. And so there's a kind of, and I'm not trying to knee-jerk bash on Russia, but Russia's model has been something that one might describe as historic imperialism and colonialism, right? Settler colonialism, occupation, military occupation. And I think the last thing to say, perhaps, that's interesting for us to consider is, just like the old analysis of slavery versus the proletariat, that it was more expensive to keep a slave than it was to keep a proletariat worker, right? That in many ways, it's a cheaper project to have developmental relations rather than colonial relations. And the economic relations that emerged in the period of decolonization didn't require military presence. It just required treaties. Right? And the last thing that's perhaps interesting to also consider here as a response is that one needs to ask, what happened to the old colonial structures? The old colonial structures didn't appear with decolonization. It wasn't just the banks, but there was a whole set of former colonial administrators who wound up seamlessly coming into roles in France, in the Netherlands, in England, as ministers of development at the national level, at the EU level, and also within the United Nations. And the structures that were present simply shifted, but remained within the countries as organizing, educating, offering health care, creating infrastructure. Those were things that had already been there, but were just shifted over and set up the foundation for this kind of relationship. Okay, I will stop.
Okay, thank you. We only have five minutes left, so I even wonder if we should have this closed session afterwards. It will be just 2-3 minutes. So I now take the decision to leave it open. Does anybody else have a question here in this hall? Do you want to ask something to our speaker? No?
It was good.
So they're saying it was good. Yeah.
I actually, I wonder, given the students there, I don't want to put them on the spot, but I do think in one of the things that I'm making more complex and is something that we're here puzzling about is what is the kind of policy intervention one makes here. And it goes back to something that I said before, that if the EU is the bank, does the bank not have the right to foster its own interests? And how do we think about what those interests are? And it might require some kind of rethinking about the fundamental values that the EU expresses. And for me, so now we're all at the same place where my thinking is. And for me, one of the things that's perhaps important to be thinking about as we develop our own policy positions is to think about interdependence and global interdependence and how that actually is possible to represent a value of its own, right? And I think that those, yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, this is very interesting, and we are also developing, as you know, Randall, and you're part of it, also these policy briefs, which are related to making recommendations more related to values than related to material policy steps. And a lot of what we heard today is about our way of thinking rather than about concrete steps of helping this or that region or interacting with this or that region. I mean, let me conclude with two remarks why I think this presentation, the speech, and the project is so interesting. One is that it has been very clear today that we need to enlarge the space of Europeanness if we talk about European values. Yeah, it is simply under-complex and not satisfying in that sense to speak of European values as something which doesn't have to do with the greater world, if you look at the past, but also if we look at today. And the second thing which emerged, I mean, if you talk about values, you at least I do sometimes think about moral values in the first place. Yeah, but if you are in the money sphere or in economics, we are talking about values all the time. And the European Union is built on economic values, bringing peace rather than moral values. It's actually quite a new thing, if looking at the history of European integration. So this has also been clear, and we will have now enough things to talk about if we should, just think about Europe as a bank. It's spreading out its values, and in the first place, being able to ask what it gets back when handing out these values. Of course, I'm joking here a bit because this is exaggerating what you actually said. But there is a certain point to that which links moral values and economic values, and this is also very important to do European studies, which we do at Viadrina, and which you do at Pittsburgh, and which we do together in our network. Thank you everybody for joining. It was a very, very rich session. I wish you a happy new year. We are on the 6th of January in 2025, so we can still wish that. Thank you, Randall, again, and I hope to see each other soon. Bye-bye.